Directors and lead researchers at the National Institute of Health are being purged. Together, these leaders oversaw $9 billion in funding. This will go down as one of the darkest days in modern scientific history in my 50 years of the business, says Michael Osterholm, an infectious diseases epidemiologist. More than 200 federal grants for research related to HIV and AIDS have been abruptly terminated in the past few weeks. They are controlling information, causing chaos, disrupting everyone, keeping us off balance. Whatever people are reading in newspapers, it's 10 times worse. We hold diverse political beliefs, but we are united as researchers in wanting to protect independent scientific inquiry. We are sending this SOS to sound a clear warning. The nation's scientific enterprise is being decimated. We call on the administration to cease its wholesale assault on U.S. science. This is signed by nearly 2,000 scientists. If you were going to publish a book about the war on science in 2025, what would you cover? Maybe how the Trump administration has fired thousands of employees at our nation's finest science agencies, or how Republicans are decimating funding for research in areas that the private sector will never fund because it's not obviously profitable for them, or how the Republican Party is destroying the NIH, or how Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, or left the World Health Organization, or promoted anti-vaxxers to positions of prominence while measles outbreaks are happening and bird flu remains a very real threat. Hell, the Trump administration just shut down the CDC's top laboratory on sexually transmitted diseases. I'm pretty sure that's something that even they will regret defunding. This list could go on for a while because the people running the US right now are arguably the biggest threats to scientific progress our nation has ever seen. I don't say that lightly. These are people who openly reject science and abhor the very scientists that contribute to our collective understanding of how the world works. I mean, it has been close to this for decades, enough that in 2005, journalist Chris Mooney wrote a best-selling book called The Republican War on Science. In 2008, during their Republican primary that year, candidates were asked if they denied evolution.
I'm curious, is there anybody on the stage that does not believe in evolution?
3 candidates for president raised their hands, and it was a controversy. Those days are now quaint, though, because the science deniers are firmly in charge. The point is, if you want to write about the war on science happening today, there's no shortage of material. The topic has never been more important, and Americans need to hear about it. Luckily, a group of well-known academics are working on a book about the biggest threats facing science in America right now. The War on Science is scheduled for publication this summer. While drafts of the book haven't been released yet, here's a glowing endorsement from Sabine Hossenfelder, a physicist, author, and popular YouTuber you probably recognize. Higher education isn't what it used to be. Cancel culture and DEI have caused many to keep their mouths shut. Not so the authors of this book. This collection of essays tells of threats to open inquiry, free speech, and the scientific process itself. A much-needed book. Oh god, it's a right-wing grievances book, isn't it? Yeah, so far all that's been released are the list of contributors to the book and the table of contents, but I'll argue that's more than enough to know that this book will not only be a waste of your time, but also an abdication of responsibility by some of the most famous scientists in this country. The book is edited by Lawrence Krauss and includes essays from Richard Dawkins, Jerry Coyne, Peter Boghossian, Steven Pinker, and many, many others. These are people who have written books about science and reason and atheism that have sold millions of copies. This time around, they're writing about supposed attacks on free speech by progressives, how academic disciplines have been corrupted by ideology because of women and LGBTQ people and people of color, cancel culture because, why not? The problems with DEI, or as they often call it, DIE. That stands for die. That's bad. You get the picture. It's a litany of right-wing grievances that I'm sure would go over just great on Joe Rogan's podcast.
Joe doubled down on what's happening in schools.
Oh, you're a cat? No, you're not. You have cat ears on. They don't even look like a cat.
As we know from reading what actual working scientists are saying right now, these are not the subjects they discuss when they're commiserating with each other. These things are not what keeps them up at night. Releasing a book like this right now is like if a group of firefighters ran into a burning building only to extinguish a few scented candles. And on the way out, they see a guy actively lighting things on fire and think, no big deal. I refuse to buy into all this reactionary nonsense about arsonists being such a problem. Okay, maybe you think I'm judging the book prematurely. What can we really say about a book that hasn't even come out yet? Well, we have the table of contents, like I said, and the list of people behind the book, so let's dig deeper into that. One subject of this book is DEI, which the editor Lawrence Krauss has celebrated dismantling. Not long ago, Krauss called on Elon Musk to defund science institutions that did any sort of DEI, arguing that over 10% of the US National Science Foundation's grants were for DEI initiatives rather than science. He calculated this, I shit you not, by asking ChatGPT to decide if each of the NSF's grants in 2023 were primarily scientific or DEI. I guess it never occurred to him that grants to underprivileged groups could also be scientific in nature, that there could be scientific value in getting input from people with different backgrounds, or, that large language models can just say things that aren't true. No, if the chatbot says that minorities are getting their science funded, that automatically means that science is under attack. Yeah, there seems to be something about getting involved in a sexual harassment scandal or two that makes guys like Krauss lose their capacity for, critical thinking. More on that later. Keeping your critical thinking skills sharp is not a matter of being like a really smart, logical guy. You have to actively invest in those skills where you can. Like, there's a measles outbreak in my state of Texas right now, but a lot of folks aren't informed on this because they only follow a handful of right-leaning news outlets, which aren't reporting on this story as much as others. Regardless of your political leanings, though, you are much more likely to see the stories that matter if you use Ground News, an independent app and website I use every day, recommend to my friends in real life, and have gladly partnered with for years now. Check them out at ground.news/skeptic. Taking a look at this article, we can see that of the 33 sources reporting on this story, only 3% lean right, making this a big blind spot for that side. Comparing coverage here is interesting too. Right-leaning sources plainly state that an outbreak has started in Texas, while left-leaning sources use more charged language, emphasizing RFK Jr.'s stance on vaccinations. Ground News organizes every published perspective on an issue in one place with data on each outlet's political bias, credibility, and financial incentives. One of my favorite features is their blind spot feed. It shows you important stories that are being completely ignored by one side of the political spectrum or another, like this one. This way, your own bias doesn't have you missing stories that you do need to see. Really, no matter who you are, what you believe, whether you agree with me or not, I think you're better off with this feature on an app right there in your pocket at all times. Look, critical thinking is still your responsibility, but you can make it easier with the right tools. So I highly recommend you go to ground.news/skeptic or scan the QR code on your screen. There you can get the same Vantage plan that I use every day for just $5 a month. Ground News also makes my highly researched and produced videos possible in the first place, so go support my favorite sponsor and you'll be supporting me, my channel, my work at the same time. Okay, back to the video. For now, consider this book section on free speech. The supposed threat discussed here is pretty clear from the essay titles: progressive university professors and students. Gad Saad's section will cover universities as dispensers of parasitic ideas. Now, if you've ever read Saad's book, The Parasitic Mind, first of all, I'm sorry. But second of all, you'll know that he's already written about this extensively. I actually just finished reading this book for an upcoming video, and I can tell you, Gad Saad's writing on this subject, and most other subjects in that book, contains very little actual argumentation. Rather, he positions himself as correct on a myriad of issues by inventing derogatory terms for ideas and people he doesn't like, or by comparing them to obviously bad things like diseases or terrorists. In the same way that brain parasites have evolved to take advantage of their hosts in the furtherance of their evolutionary objectives, parasitic viruses of the human mind, devastatingly bad ideas, function in a similar manner. They parasitize human minds, rendering them impervious to critical thinking, while finding clever ways to spread across a given population. For example, getting students to enroll in women's studies departments. Yeah, that's the bulk of an argument against women's studies for him. In that book, he repeatedly compares so-called social justice warriors to Islamic terrorists. I'll put quotes of his on screen here, pause if you want to read them. He calls critics who cancel people the Taliban. He says that words of political correctness are just like the words that the 9/11 hijacker spoke to the passengers on the flight. Nobody move and nobody gets hurt, that kind of thing. And he calls students that he considers overly reactive naturally lobotomized. Wow, you got him, man. No need to get into any actual specifics and make real arguments. Everyone on the playground now recognizes your genius. Look, I'm not going to say that progressive people, whether students or otherwise, never overreact to things they find offensive or harmful. They do sometimes. People do sometimes. Sometimes universities don't handle conflict well either. Sometimes this turns situations that really could have been resolved into heated political drama where students and professors leave departments. That sucks. And as someone on the left who has friends in academia, I can't acknowledge that. Let me ask though, are the SJWs who are killing free speech with the supposed zeal of literal terrorists banning scientists from using a list of words that often occur in research that they don't like? That would be a huge violation of free speech, right? For people who just like to listen to these videos, know that I'm putting things on screen that the Trump administration has done and then sarcastically asking Gad Saad if, SJWs have done them. Okay, resume sarcasm. It would also be awful if they were ordering NIH scientists to study things that only partisan pundits say are a huge problem, despite all previous research to the contrary. God, imagine if they did that and scientists spoke out, saying things like, if these proposed studies move forward, it will create a distorted research ecosystem where only politically favorable findings are permitted to exist, and an evidence vacuum for clinicians who are trying to do right by their patients. Are the woke calling it and trying to legally classify it as domestic terrorism to protest one specific company and trying to use law enforcement to quell their opposition? Are the radical feminists arresting and deporting college students for criticizing them and their friends? No. Nothing even close. Seriously, I just don't believe that you really care about free speech on college campuses when you refuse to identify threats to free speech on college campuses. We just saw the Trump administration detain and try to deport Mahmoud Khalil, who is legally here with a student visa, for leading pro-Palestinian rallies on Columbia University's campus. He's still in custody as of the filming of this video for doing nothing but exercising his free speech. The same goes for Rumesa Ozturk. She was arrested by plainclothes ICE agents and taken from Massachusetts to a detention center in Louisiana for, get this, writing an op-ed in a school newspaper critical of her university's stance on Israel's massacre of Gaza. Even the president of her university, who she directly criticized in her op-ed, is calling for her release, and the Trump administration still refuses to release her. She's here legally under a valid student visa, yet they are trying to deport her for expressing her opinion. It literally does not matter if you disagree with that opinion or not. This is a violation of human rights. This is how serious the threat to free speech is. Like, come on, this is obvious, right? We just saw the Trump administration cancel $400 million in grants and contracts from Columbia University for allowing pro-Palestine rallies to even take place. Now they're looking to withhold $9 billion from Harvard and hundreds of millions from other schools for similar reasons. Because these schools allowed free speech, they're now being punished in a way that actually impedes real scientific research. How much space do you think this book will have to talk about any of that? Given that Gad Saad has praised the far-right authoritarian regime in Hungary for not allowing demonstrations for Palestine, I think I can guess. On to section 3 of the book, cancel culture. In theory, this would be about a professor getting fired for raising a tough question or something. As science enthusiasts, we should welcome tough questions, even ones that challenge us. Famously, the theory of evolution was a scientific challenge to traditional beliefs, and it wasn't immediately accepted. But it did hold up to scrutiny and was eventually accepted. By most people.
We then read that a pair of every kind went with Noah on board the ark. Must have included dinosaurs.
Point is, there's nothing wrong with challenging ideas you think are wrong, and if you're punished for raising such a point, that's not good. So what examples of that do we see in this book? Well, one of the chapters is Why I Left Harvard by Carol Hooven, and it turns out she's published a version of this essay in the right-wing publication, The Free Press. So, how did she get canceled? In 2021, she appeared on a rather panicked Fox News segment where she was asked to comment on a report from one med student that her classmates pressured some of her professors to move away from using terms like male and female in reference to a strict gender binary, and pregnant woman in reference to anyone who is pregnant. One professor apparently listened and did so. This isn't a banning of those terms or even moving away from using those terms in particular situations when it makes sense to use them. It's just not always using them all the time in every situation, even ones where, you might be describing populations that aren't described by those words. Hooven, however, said it was a big mistake that anyone was shifting away from these terms because it ceded ground to people who say biological sex isn't real and instead define sex based on their own personal feelings. This is a very common misrepresentation of the idea that gender and sex are different things, that both of them exist on a spectrum, and that our language hasn't quite caught up to this fact yet. Seriously, this is a linguistics problem, not a science problem. Hooven says she did display tolerance in this piece because she said,
but, we can treat people with respect and respect their gender identities and, use their preferred pronouns.
But there were very obvious signs that she was a part of a bad faith, rage-baiting piece from Fox News over, let me remind you, one professor changing their vocabulary.
Well, you could do that,
but
we can't back out of saying words like male, female, or pregnant woman, please. Medical schools now reportedly denying biological sex altogether. But what happens when woke ideology undermines future doctors?
She also clearly bought into the fearful narrative it meant to spread, that understanding and or acknowledging trans and intersex people is always an act of forced political compliance, and is never motivated by genuinely held, well-informed beliefs.
It's very confusing when professors like me or lecturers like me and even journalists and people in the mainstream media start backing away from certain terms that they're afraid people will find offensive. We're doing students and the public a huge disservice.
Yep.
And we're also dividing the populace.
Yes.
Here I am in Fox News. This isn't what I traditionally watch, but I'm happy to be here to be speaking to an audience that I think understands what I'm saying.
Yeah. I didn't think it was a stretch to know the difference between male and female and pregnant women and non-pregnant women.
I agree.
Thanks so much, Carol. Appreciate it.
I mean, come on. If you're really naive enough to see this as good faith journalism after the fact, I have an incredible and increasingly valuable meme coin to sell you. People at her school were upset about her part in that Fox News piece. They complained about it. It became an issue that spilled over to Twitter, of course. By Hooven's own account, right-wing outlets amplified the outrage, and then some online trolls made homophobic and racist threats against a person who complained. Hooven didn't acknowledge the problems with the piece after this. But then what happened? Did Hooven get fired or formally punished or something? No. She requested reducing her hours in response to the stress of the situation. No grad students wanted to work with her, and then she quit. To summarize, she's not suggesting that she was punished for having some unpopular theory and that people were afraid of asking questions in the academic environment. She acted as a tool with which right-wing media could create moral panic. The consequences were that people didn't want to be around her as much, and then she left her job because she couldn't stand that disagreement. Based on this, what is cancel culture in this book? It's the political in-group having to face disagreement when they say or do something that's honestly just dumb. Then, instead of adjusting their views based on new information or just tolerating an environment with free speech, they run to a place where they can double down and be praised for it. Oh, and call their experience an existential threat to science itself while ignoring massive, tangible threats to science. All right, on to the people involved with this book and why they don't give me the best vibes, why I'm not optimistic about what this book will look like given their involvement. Now, the narrative around editor Lawrence Krauss is generally that he was a respected physicist before doing some sexual harassment and tanking his career as anything but an online edgelord. But, well, Krauss was good friends with Jeffrey Epstein and continued to accept money from Epstein even after the latter pleaded guilty to soliciting minors for prostitution. Krauss defended Epstein back in 2011 with one of the most disturbing, poorly aging, and downright arrogant quotations you'll ever hear. Jeffrey has surrounded himself with beautiful women and young women, but they're not as young as the ones that were claimed. As a scientist, I always judge things on empirical evidence, and he always has women ages 19 to 23 around him, but I've never seen anything else. So, as a scientist, my presumption is that whatever the problems were, I would believe him over other people. I don't feel tarnished in any way by my relationship with Jeffrey. I feel raised by it. Fucking yikes. Yeah, this guy's critical thinking skills are totally intact. Meanwhile, contributors Jerry Coyne and Richard Dawkins primarily talk about trans people now, insisting that trans activists dogmatically insist that biological sex just doesn't exist at all, or is not relevant in any way to gender. What they always fail to mention, though, is specifically who. Who is saying this? Like, give me a name. I talk to trans people regularly. I've never heard anyone say this. Oh, and they also argue that trans people are more likely to be sexual predators than other people and shouldn't be allowed to have certain jobs because of that. Yeah, plenty of folks have called them out for saying this, and their response across the board has been to call their critics hysterical and say that they're a part of a biology-denying religious cult. Seriously, read this article if you don't believe me. Steven Pinker is involved here, another man who, if you didn't know, contributed to the legal defense of Jeffrey Epstein. Peter Boghossian, another guy who resigned from his university after students used their free speech against his takes on issues involving gender and race. Also, for what it's worth, I was going to save this fact for an upcoming video, but I'll spoil it a little bit for you guys here. Boghossian received $600,000 from Andrew Conru in 2022 to 2023. Who's Conru? Only the CEO of Adult Friend Finder and one of the largest financial backers of the Human Diversity Foundation, a pro-eugenics racist pseudoscience organization originally founded in 1937 to spread Nazi eugenics propaganda in the United States. Jordan Peterson is another contributor, because you know which voice of reason we really need to include? The guy who tweeted out fetish porn because he seriously believed it came from a communist Chinese sperm extraction factory. Hemant, the things you're making me say in this video. This guy also claimed that the caduceus, this symbol dating back to ancient Greece, indicated that ancient shamans uncovered innate human knowledge of the helical structure of DNA through ritualistic use of psychedelic drugs.
I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA.
This is also the guy that right now, in the year of our Lord 2025, is teaching that atheism and Marxism are literally satanic. And not in the cool feminism and human rights way, but in the oh, spooky, spooky, we must burn them now kind of way. Other contributors to this book include those whose personal controversies include calling for more white people and fewer Asians in the country, arguing that the bones of indigenous people belong to science and not their people, denouncing Black Lives Matter while backing the use of the N-word, denying the impacts of climate change, perpetuating the opioid crisis, getting accused of gender-based harassment, getting accused of sexual misconduct, etc. Just a rogues gallery of people who do shitty things, face criticism for that, and then pretend to be the true victims. In short, these are largely people who have, at some point, very publicly undermined their own credibility, subsequently found a home among Republicans, and now claim to understand the real attacks on science. The woke libs. Naturally, it looks like no part of this book will cover the harm caused by Republicans who, I'll remind you, are in power and are actively dismantling some of the greatest scientific institutions that have ever existed. If you're not fatigued yet, I'm going to keep going. What kind of publisher would put this out, you might ask? Good question. The answer will not surprise you. In 2021, after being a part of the police raid that shot and killed an unarmed Breonna Taylor in her Louisville apartment, police officer Jonathan Mattingly announced that he was going to publish his own version of events in The Fight for Truth, the inside story behind the Breonna Taylor tragedy. There was so much backlash to the idea of a killer cop profiting off of the murder of a black woman that Simon & Schuster refused to distribute the book even though it was being published by one of its imprints. Here's what the New York Times said about it. Like much of the American public, earlier today, Simon & Schuster learned of plans by distribution client Post Hill Press to publish a book by Jonathan Mattingly, the publisher said in a statement. We have subsequently decided not to be involved in the distribution of this book. The Times described the publisher behind that book, Post Hill Press, as one that specializes in Christian and conservative political books, and that company stood by Mattingly. Kelsey Merritt, a spokesperson for Post Hill Press, said in a statement that it still planned to publish the book. His story is important, and it deserves to be heard by the public at large, she said. We feel strongly that an open dialogue is essential to shining a light on the challenging issues our country is facing. The same publisher put out a book by conspiracy theorist Dan Bongino, who, now helps run the FBI, and the publisher used to be led by someone who ran Humanix Books, a subsidiary of the right-wing outlet Newsmax. That is the publisher that Krauss, Dawkins, and all the rest are now working to release their book. What does it say about them and the book itself that this War on Science book is being released by a conservative outlet that champions books from killer cops and pseudoscientific conspiracy theorists? If that's the only publisher willing to work with you on this, maybe it's a sign that your book is bad, that your morality is broken, and your work isn't actually worth anything to the scientific community. There is absolutely a valuable book about the modern war on science that is just waiting to be written. This one, however, is a farce before a single page has even been released. Still, I expect this book to sell just fine. The anti-woke crowd that currently controls every branch of the United States government and dominates the media landscape thrives on propaganda like this. It identifies an enemy which the anti-woke guys can publicly demonize, thereby taking attention off of their actions, which actually include decimating scientific institutions and eliminating free speech. In a country where a real war on science is being waged right now, it's those that side with the aggressors in power who are best rewarded, and not those who actually fight to keep speech free and science research funded. A special thanks to Hemant Mehta for co-writing this video and breaking this story way before me. You can check out his work and support it at friendlyatheist.com. His YouTube channel is Friendly Atheist. All right, with that, thank you for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. A special thanks to my patrons for their constant love and support. If you want to support my work, subscribe and check out the religious studies courses I produce with Dr. Joseph Laycock. They are attached to the video below. As always, if you are an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay skeptical.